You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 4 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover. And I'm so thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. So today we're going to be talking about the Paleoindian period in the Great Plains Archaeology. Last episode, we broke down in like 30 minutes the different periods of time within the Great Plains. And I apologize if you hear my cat Laramie. I've been traveling a lot recently, and she's been needing some attention since I've gotten back, which is also why, if for those of you that are watching the podcast on YouTube, you see that I'm still recording out of my apartment and not in my office. And it's a Sunday morning as I'm recording this. That's why my hair's down. I'm in a t-shirt. Like it's just a relaxing Sunday. And so today we're just going to be talking about the Paleoindian period. And there's a lot to talk about because the Paleoindian period is, archaeologically speaking, when humans arrive. So there's a couple really big topics that surround Paleoindian. One is what represents the first peoples. The second is what happened to all the Ice Age megafauna. And how have archaeologists written about and researched Paleoindian archaeology? How does that inform our understanding of what's going on? So there's a lot to talk about, and I don't think we're going to be able to hit it all today, but I came from the University of Wyoming where I got my master's, and that is a big Paleoindian department like Clovis and Folsom, and I worked at Hell Gap National Historic Landmark. I'm doing a field school there at the University of Kansas. So I really wanted to spend this episode really talking about peopling, really, to set the stage for how the Great Plains gets occupied. And a lot of people are familiar with the Bering Land Bridge and walking over the ice bridge type of thing, the ice-free corridor, and that's how people get to the plains. And so under that old model, one of the places that ice-free corridor just dumps people out is in the Great Plains. And so like a lot of some of the earliest Paleoindian sites that were recovered in the early 20th century, Folsom, Blackwater Draw, Dent, 12 Mile Creek, they're all in the Great Plains for the most part. Folsom, not so much. It's in the Southwest. But what we know today, right, the Paleoindian period, we know for a fact it is starting around 13,000 years ago. Like, we know people are creating the archaeological record at that time. The problem is, or the controversy that continues to, I want to say, plague Paleoindian archaeology, but definitely is still a hot topic, is were people here before that? And so there's a couple of places on the Great Plains that would suggest otherwise if you're just to read the literature. And so in the plains, the first widely accepted diagnostic archaeological signature of people involves the Clovis lithic complex. Some people call it a culture. I do not. The Clovis points are a type of projectile point that are lancelet. Roughly half the time they're fluted or they're basally thinned. They look very different than Folsom, which comes right after Clovis at around 10,800. So this Clovis period is roughly between, confirmed, 13,000 BC and 10,800 BCE. So, 15,000 years ago to 12,000, basically 13,000 years ago. It's pretty quick. But when we talk about diagnostic artifacts, when you find a Clovis point at a site, that's how it gets assigned part of this quote-unquote Clovis culture. Now, does technology represent cultures? Does it represent people? Not really. I don't think. But with Paleoindian archaeology, where they don't have pottery, where they have very few diagnostic objects outside of the stone tool assemblage, that's where we get this idea that points equals people, which just isn't true. But we know Clovis, and Clovis is all over North America. So it arrives The earliest sites are about 15,000 years ago, and they're like all over North America. But what we know now through work on the ice-free corridor is it doesn't look like the corridor wasn't even open till after Clovis arrived. So the last glacial maximum, the extent of the last glaciers in the Pleistocene, was about 24,000 years ago, and then they started receding, which it still took a long time. And at the last glacial maximum, water levels, sea levels, were about 100 meters lower than they are today, so about 300 feet, which is extensive. So I mean, like large swaths of land were opened up. But the corridors in Canada and the Northwest U.S. weren't open. So the ice sheets did not open until roughly 11,000 and 13,000 years ago. So after Clovis was established. So how did people get here? And in addition to that, then we have Monteverde, which is in the southern end of Chile, which has people there over 14,000 years ago. So how did people get here? So people must have gotten around those ice sheets. And that's where a lot of archaeologists promote and have accepted the Pacific Coast hypothesis that there was a maritime route that went from Northeast Asia. They followed the coast of the Bering Land Bridge and went into North America that way. And that's why people got around so quickly. That area would have been very, very dense and rich in marine resources. And we're not talking like people were Polynesians sailing around on like a boat for long periods of time. They were just following the coast. But what about the plains? And so that's when we start getting into like, well, we're gonna ignore Cerruti first off, the Cerruti mammoth kill site in California, which is like allegedly 130,000 years ago. We're just going to ignore that. We have the footprints at White Sands that are around 22,000 years ago that are still hotly debated. No diagnostic artifacts, right? Just footprints. But giant ground sloth were known to inhabit that area. So I don't know what juvenile ground sloth feet look like. They might look a little human. That's all I'm saying. But in the plains, we don't really have what's considered pre-Clovis. And even that term pre-Clovis is really, I wouldn't say toxic, but debatable, because that term means is there people here earlier than people that with the Clovis technology? And some of these sites don't have a toolkit. So we know people have said there's a fire here, or we have some stone tool debitage, but no diagnostic artifacts. Doesn't mean it's pre-Clovis, or doesn't mean that they are people with Clovis technology that didn't leave the tech behind, and therefore Clovis would be earlier. These are all the questions that we're saddled with. On the plains, we have a couple sites that were excavated by Steve Holland, same guy who wrote about Cerruti down in California. You have Lacina in Nebraska, and you have Lovewell Lake in Kansas. And both of these sites do not include diagnostic artifacts, but they do include mammoth that have some weirdly fractured bones, which Steve suggests show evidence of butchering. I'll leave that up for you guys to decide. Steve is an incredible guy. I really like him. I'm very excited he moved down to Topeka recently. Then you do have like the Galt and Deborah Friedkin site down in Texas. But when it's a multi-component site, it's both of them. They're in clay, and they also have like the oldest components of every archaeological culture in the Paleoindian period, but there's no real soil stratigraphy. So it's really hard to suss it out, and they're not dating the objects. They're dating organics in the clay. And so it becomes hard to confirm whether those are indeed pre-Clovis. But from my perspective as an archaeologist, I do believe, based on human behavior and some of the earlier sites, that there are people here earlier than the Clovis time range, whether they had Clovis technologies to be determined. Because if you look at Clovis archaeology, Clovis equipped people were knew where all the things were on the landscape. Like they are behaviorally not acting like a colonizing population or migratory population. They know where everything is. And there's a really good article by Bonnie Pitblato down in Oklahoma called On Rehumanizing Pleistocene People of the Western Hemisphere, where essentially Bonnie, really respectfully, and I really like this article, like talks about, hey, we need to bring anthropology back to Paleoindian archaeology, because Paleoindian archaeologists, by and large, they're not being racist or demeaning or malicious. but they treat Paleoindian archaeology like they're studying animals. Like if you read the Paleoindian literature, it's very much, prey choice analysis and caloric return rates. Like they're looking at people as statistical animals rather than people with culture. But part of that is the fact that the archaeological record, the assemblages that Paleoindian archaeologists are working with are stones and bones, right? They're not getting some of the more elaborate material culture that other archaeological assemblages in time, like what I work in Plains Village period, where I do have houses and pottery and a lot more material culture to work with, where we can look at things like identity and migration and warfare. Paleoindian archaeologists don't have that. So it's a mix of what can they tell out of the record and to keep it like grounded in scientific fact or scientific analyses versus adding the anthropology on that. But also part of Bonnie's article kind of like does talk about like, hey, Clovis, these people like know the landscape really well, which does not suggest that they're colonizing populations. And it could be very clear that as people are traveling up and down the coast, they don't know where the stone tool resources are. As they're traveling and migrating into the Great Plains, their toolkits are organic materials. So like maybe they're just sharpening wooden stakes or because they don't know where the stones are. And a good, I wouldn't say example, but of necessarily pre-Clovis, but if you look at the Mahaffey cache, which is at the Boulder Museum, where it's a cache of stones that was hidden and recovered when someone was doing landscaping, there are no diagnostic artifacts. There's these giant, look like old Awan hand axes, and you can trace the migratory pattern of those people or their path because all the stone tools come from a pathway between Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado, and you can see them collecting stuff on their way down, and then they hid this cache to come back for later use, and they didn't find it. And they know it's a Paleo-Indian era site because when they did residue analysis of the stone tools, they found camel DNA, horse DNA, so DNA belonging to animals that were around during the Ice Age that aren't around today. So that's how they're able to date it. Is it Clovis? Is it pre-Clovis? Well, there's no diagnostic artifacts. They're complete stone tools, but there are no Clovis points. But that kind of behavior seems like people are collecting as they're traveling through the Rocky Mountains. They're purposely collecting raw materials that they don't know if they're going to come back to, and they have a stash of them. And then they stash it somewhere on the outside of Boulder and the Rocky Mountain Front Range, and then something happens and they never come back. They must have hit it too well. So with that, we're going to be right back in the second half, just continuing on our conversation with Paleoindian. So we'll be right back. And we're back here at the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I don't know if there's even ads. We were doing that with the ruins too. Like, we'll be right back after these ads by Chris and Rachel. And then there weren't ads, and we'd listen to it later. Be like, oh, that's a little embarrassing. But, and I don't want to really dive into the whole Clovis first thing, just kind of throwing it out there. But on the Great Plains proper, do we have evidence of something older than Clovis? We have the couple sites by Steve Holland in Nebraska and Kansas. There are no diagnostic artifacts, no charcoal, just some weirdly broken mammoth bones. So the jury is still out. And if people are indeed migrating, which we believe, right, they're coming along the Pacific coast. We do not on this podcast talk about Solutrean coming from Europe. That is wildly debunked. We all know that. We're not even going to talk about it. I think we talk about it on Ruins in one of the earlier episodes, but regardless, if people are sailing along the western coast, they have to use their old legs to get to the Great Plains. So the earlier sites that are most likely to be older than Clovis and have a different technological package are going to be found along the west coast of the United States, not necessarily the Great Plains. In addition to, it doesn't mean that there was multiple waves of migration from Asia. We have Siberian populations, we have Southeast Asian populations, ancestral, right? There's some really good work by Jennifer Raff where you can read about it, where she does the DNA work. People did, once the Bering Land Bridge and the ice-free corridor were open, people traveled that route. But the first people of the Great Plains did not. They most likely traveled along the east-west coast, and either themselves traveled to the Great Plains or their descendants traveled to the Great Plains. That is what I think. And this is explored by Bonnie, as well as in the textbook, Doug's book as well. So if you read some of the older Great Plains volumes from the 90s and early 2000s, they don't talk about pre-Clovis at all. I think Doug does a really, really good job. Now, with that being said, where are the earliest sites? So the whole idea of people being here during the Ice Age was not published or understood until the 1920s and 30s, which up until that point in the 1800s, European paleontologists and archaeologists, they were coming across Ice Age animals, dead, of course, that had human stone-like points and knives and blades associated with them. So they knew people in Europe had been there as old as the Ice Age. And it was a really hot topic here in North America, right? Because you still have a lot of genocide and reservation systems and the kill the Indian, save the man. And so it's kind of convenient for some folks to be like, well, we don't have any evidence that Indians were actually here during the Ice Age, so they couldn't have been here that long. So, sucks to suck that, they're almost gone. But the first evidence of Paleoindian recovered in the Great Plains is the 12 Mile Creek site. This is a fascinating story that I think we'll dive into. Well, we'll just dive into it now. 12 Mile Creek in Kansas was excavated by paleontologists from the University of Kansas in the late 1800s, like 1897, 1898. And there were 12 bison antiquus remains that were found. So these are Pleistocene bison, later believed to be Bison occidentalis. It was a huge site for paleontological reasons, but they found a fluted point in 1898. Now, there's a whole story about the point goes missing. We have photographs of it. I have them. They're under my purview at the University of Kansas, but it's never published. Not until in the 1920s, when some archaeologists from the from the Denver Museum of Natural History come out to Folsom, New Mexico on bequest of some ranchers who were buddies with a guy named George McJunkin, who talked about the site in the 19-teens. He had passed away, but when his buddies got a car in the 20s, they drove to go check out the place that George had talked about. And they found these eroding bison. They called these archaeologists from the Denver Museum down, and they found a Folsom point, the same type that was found at 12 Mile Creek. And because it's first published based on the Folsom site, that's how we get the name Folsom Points, because the first published data on these points come from Folsom, New Mexico, where if the paleontologists at the University of Kansas hadn't lost this point, the main theme is that it was shown at a fundraising event or some lectures, the paleontologists showed the crowd and it made its way through the crowd, never came back. Then Folsom archaeology, the Folsom Point would be named 12 Mile Creek. The same thing actually happens with the Clovis points, but Folsom, let me backtrack real quick. So Folsom is the second confirmed oldest Paleoindian technology that we have in North America. And that's from 10,800 BCE to 9,800 BCE. And this is a time period where you have confirmed Clovis. Right after Clovis is Folsom. After Folsom, that's when the projectile points begin to diverge, and there's new types all across the country. And those get wrapped up in what we call the late Paleoindian period from 9,800 BC to 7,200 BCE. But Folsom, in the Folsom period, it's just Folsom points. There are a couple places where you find, Clovis and Folsom together, mixed together, which makes sense because it's not like 10,800 years ago when Folsom, quote unquote, starts. Like a call went out across the hemisphere that's like, hey guys, we're done with the Clovis. This is Folsom. Stop what you're doing. Get rid of your Clovis points. Just do Folsom. There is a transition, right? So these hard cutoffs in the literature about, well, if Clovis ends here, Folsom starts here, right? They're approximate. There are transitions. It's not a massive change that happens within a day. It takes years, if not hundreds of years, for that to change. But in the Paleoindian period, for about 1,000 or about 2,000 years, you have Clovis. You have Folsom for 1,000 years after, and then you have this divergence that are regional of different late Paleoindian points that are still large, and then we get into the Archaic, and that's not the focus of today. We're talking about Paleoindian today. But the same thing happens with Clovis. So Folsom is the first Paleoindian thing found. Both 12 Mile Creek and Folsom, those Folsom points were found in situ or direct context with hunted Paleo or Pleistocene bison, confirming that indigenous people were here during the Ice Age. And that was a big deal back in the early 20th century, because there was that mythos of like, well, if Indians weren't here that long ago, like getting rid of them is not that big of a problem. We know people were here since the Ice Age. That was a huge deal. Clovis is found later, like a couple years later. First, you have Clovis. It's in New Mexico, named after, it's found at the site called Blackwater Draw. That's where the first published Clovis assemblage was talked about. I've also heard the Dent site in Colorado was found first, but I don't think the dates match up. I'll have to confirm with my source. But Dent is also another early one. And if they had published first, Clovis points would be called Dent points, right? So it's all about, who publishes first rather than who finds it first. Whoever can get their data out the quickest, that they become the ones that hold that moniker. During this time period, as we discussed in the last episode, we're really talking about hunting and gathering populations of folks that are, as part of their diet, hunting Pleistocene megafauna. I don't subscribe to the overkill hypothesis, which is that the reason why Pleistocene megafauna went extinct in the Americas is because humans got here and wiped them all out. That's ridiculous, in my opinion. Humans didn't help, but I think the end of the Ice Age and the climate getting warmer and the geography drastically changing in the Great Plains had more to contribute to these large cold climate adapted mammals on this giant savanna than like a bunch of hairless monkeys running around in a couple dozen, like murder hoboing their way across North America. Right. People, if you've listened to Life in Ruins, my stance on this. And I don't want to dive into it too much. But they're definitely hunting animals. It's easier to find the elephants, like the butchered elephants and stuff, because they are elephant remains. They're huge, rather than the bunny kills, which aren't going to preserve in the archaeological record. But mobile hunters and gatherers, there's some really cool sites I think we'll talk about more specifically. I think next episode. Yeah, that's what we'll do. Next episode, we'll talk about the Hell Gap National Historic Landmark, which has it's an incredible Paleoindian site on top of everything else. And it also is a good way to transition to the Archaic. So we'll do that. So Paleoindian, we're talking about the Ice Age, the end of the Ice Age, the megafauna are going away. In terms of what else is around, we don't have, like the Archaic, which we'll talk about later. That's where we start to see a little bit more monumentality and investment in landscapes and space to create bison drives. But at this point, people are just arriving. Paleoindian archaeology is First Peoples of the America archaeology, hunting and gathering archaeology, Ice Age archaeology. There's not much to that record other than the stones and bones. You can find bone needles and like shell beads, which are cool, and they're a part of that. But the Paleoindian archaeological record is just not as rich in material cultural diversity as, woodland and plains village period. And of course, because of it's in the Ice Age, you're more likely to find Paleoindian points further south in the Great Plains, because like Canada's locked up in a glacier. No one's running around there. So the United States proper, the mainland US, the lower 48, that's where you're going to find more like Clovis and Folsom. Alaska has its own thing going on, but Alaska is not part of the Great Plains, so we're not going to talk about it. But this is kind of, just Paleoindian archaeology in a nutshell. Highly recommend folks interested in Paleoindian archaeology to read Bonnie's article. I know it wasn't received well by some people, but it's a really good read that really looks at like, hey, we need to bring anthropology back into Paleoindian archaeology. So with that, thank you guys so much for listening to episode 4 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Next episode, we are going to be talking about Hell Gap National Historic Landmark. We'll talk about a full site. We're starting to get into it. 4 episodes in. Let's talk about some actual archaeology. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.